Oh, hi. I'm back with another article. This is the article called "The Man Who Could Turn into an Elephant: Shape Shifting Among the Karanko of Sierra Leone." And I don't have a map for you this week because hopefully by now you know where Sierra Leone is. It's in West Africa. This is the Karanko are a Mande speaking people, so they're going to share a lot in common with the folks that you read the Sunjata book about. And you might also recall that we've talked about this part of the world when we talked about Rosalind Shaw's article that was about um, the long term implications of enslavement and how those ideas have filtered into this culture's language and also into their symbolism. And we're going to see some of that again today in this Michael Jackson article. So, Michael Jackson is um, a cultural anthropologist, and let me go ahead and get my presentation here. And he's also a deceased pop music star. This is also Michael Jackson with an elephant and our girl Liz Taylor. But it's not the same Michael Jackson. This is a different Michael Jackson. This Michael Jackson who wrote this article is a cultural anthropologist. He's from New Zealand and he spent a lot of time in Sierra Leone. And one of the reasons that this article is kind of dear to me is because I had an experience during my field work where I was talking to a man who was a drum maker, and we were sitting in his workshop and he was making a drum, and we were talking about drumming and making drums more specifically. And he mentioned to me that earlier that day he had been a crocodile. His name was Bamba, that was his family name. And I said, "I'm so sorry. I thought that you said today when you were a crocodile." And he said, "Oh, yeah, that is what I said." And so then we started talking about this idea of shape shifting. And, to be quite honest, I think that this man was pulling my leg and he was trying to share some information with me about some ideas that exist in his culture that maybe people don't believe in anymore. But one of the things that Jackson discusses in this article is that he first became aware of this phenomenon of shapeshifting when he was in Sierra Leone in the 1970s. And then he goes back periodically to visit again and again. And one of the things that he, I think, captures in this article is how the belief in shapeshifting changes and to a large degree falls out of favor, except for a select group of people for whom shapeshifting maintains a cultural significance. So that's what we'll be talking about today, because in this week's readings, we're really talking about notions of supernatural, ideas about faith, ideas about religion, ideas about um, ideology. And unlike the stuff in the previous weeks where we've talked about history and then we've talked about identity construction, or like kinship, families, some of the material this week can be a little bit more sensitive because obviously faith is a challenging thing to talk about, because what is faith? Where do we get faith? And then how valuable or how significant is faith when we study world cultures? I mean, you know as well as I do that there are ideas that people are quite willing to die for and to be combative over and to, um, really defend. And so we always need to be very sensitive and also have our cultural relativism hats on when we talk about faith and when we talk about people's ideas, because um, ideas are part of the fabric of what gives our lives meaning. And frequently, it is the case that ideas are more significant than things. So, just to start as a caveat here, I think this is a really interesting article because it tries to examine faith from a number of perspectives. And like the Lisa Cliggett book that we talked about last week, there's a longitudinal direction in here. And I do have some remarks in today's lecture that will reference back to Lisa Cliggett's book, which I have right here. I did have right here. Anyway, I'll find it. Oh, it's right here on this side. So I'll make a few remarks about chapter 6. So let's start by talking about one form of religion, and this is the idea of animism. And in your Anthropology 100 classes, you probably talked about animism and what it is. Frequently, animism is understood as being the oldest form of faith, or maybe the earliest kind of faith that anthropologists are interested in. And there's an anthropologist named Tyler, Sir Edward Tyler, who wrote a book called Primitive Cultures in 1871. Screech! Let's stop and look at the title of his book, Primitive Cultures. This word is troubling for us, right? It's a real problem. Edward Tyler lived in a time where anthropologists did not do a lot of their own field work. Tyler did not go to the field. He was there in England, and he was at the center of empire. And a lot of the accounts of other cultures that Tyler was using to work with in order to develop his theories and to write his books came from religious missionaries and also came from explorers. And so I think we can agree that some of the information that he was receiving, or I guess we could call it his data, was potentially flawed because it was collected by people who themselves were not necessarily specialists in cultures, and also who potentially had an agenda. I mean, if you're a missionary and you go to another place and you're invested in people accepting the beliefs that you've brought to them, you can imagine that there's also sometimes this conflict between the missionary and the idea of the people who are living in a place practicing another form of faith. Um, Tyler and all of the anthropologists of his generation had what we sometimes call an evolutionary view of culture, or sometimes it's called the unilineal evolutionary view of culture, which is to say that their idea was that cultures became increasingly complex and increasingly sophisticated and, you know, increasingly better, so that there's a value placed here on the word primitive that I think today is, I mean, just blatantly offensive. We look at that and we're like, what? That is insulting. That's an insulting word to use to talk about another group of people, and also to talk about their religion. I guess if we want to sort of get a little more specific about, well, what do these folks mean when they say animism, and what do we mean when we talk about animism today? It comes from this word in Latin, which means life force. And I think I've already told you, if you want to think about what animism might look like, think about your understanding of the Star Wars universe and the idea of the force. Animists believe that there are supernatural forces inhabiting the world that they live in. And frequently, those things in the world are imbued with soul or spirit. Sometimes those souls and spirits are gendered so that there can be this sense of balance that's very important to animists, that the world is held in check by equal and opposing notions of male and female, and lightness and darkness, and maybe sun and moon, and land and sea. That frequently those elements of nature are are thought to exist in general, in balance or in harmony with other elements of nature. But of course, there's always the danger that the balance can be disrupted. And when you're talking about animism and you're talking about balance, that disruption can really affect people, and can create things like storms, or can create things like hurricanes, tornadoes, that human beings have a vested interest in maintaining a balance with the supernatural forces that inhabit the landscape that they live in. And one way of keeping this balance is in paying homage to those souls and those spirits by offering them respect, and sometimes maybe offering them some kind of, um, something of value, um, you know, maybe making a small sacrifice, maybe saying a prayer, maybe doing a ritual. This is something that individual people can do as they move through their days, being respectful of the landscape, being respectful of the forces that exist within it. But it's also the type of thing that sometimes is called upon, um, is the community calls upon a ritual practitioner, a specialist, somebody who has some training or who has some experience in being an intermediary with the supernatural forces. And those folks can be shamans or priests. Typically speaking, when we use these two terms in anthropology, when we talk about a priest, we're often talking about someone who has a formal training, someone who has fulfilled some set of um, curriculum curricula that are set out. And they don't necessarily have to be literate, but they do have to have a certain set of trainings that the group would recognize as standardized, as opposed to a shaman who typically has a training through an apprenticeship. And there can be all different levels of mastery of shamanism. Also, a lot of times, these ritual specialists who act as, um, supernatural guides or supernatural mediators are often called upon to do things like healing. So these would also sometimes be like the doctors or the pharmacists or the psychologists of a community. These would be the people who would be called upon when a person was not well, because that is a kind of a disruption in the community. So, um, that's sort of a grounding in the term animism, which I'm confident that most of you have heard the term before, but I think it's always good just to agree on, first of all, where did the term come from? And second of all, what specifically are we referencing here? There's not one group that's more animistic than another group. There's a lot of cultures out there who have practices of animism. And it's also important to remember that, particularly in Africa, but honestly, all around the world, it's often the case that animism is being practiced simultaneously with other types of religious influences. So you have people practicing animism and also practicing, for example, Christianity, or you have people practicing animism and have some elements of Islam. this is this type of combination of two or more religions is called syncretism. Syncretism. We'll talk about it some more in another lecture. But very commonly, people in Africa are syncretic. They have multiple religious traditions that they're observing. So, in this article, what we're introduced to is something called the Yelamafentigi. And it just means shapeshifter. Um, Fen means thing. Yelama means um, like magic shaping. Um, so a tigi is someone who has mastery of something. A nu means a person. So this is a Yelama Fin Tiginu, a shapeshifter. And here we have an image that is of a leopard shapeshifter. Um, they're referenced in Jackson's article. There really aren't very many leopards in Sierra Leone, but there are leopards in other parts of Africa. So this shapeshifting tradition is understood in a number of places. When Jackson sits down to talk about shapeshifting from his main informant, who's a guy called Muhammad Fofana, Fofana explains to him that not everyone can be a shapeshifter. Some people have more capacity for being shapeshifters than other people. It's explained to Jackson as um, being a belly in thing, so a baroko, something innate, something intrinsic is a belly in thing, something that you know inside of your body. But it was also explained as a morgo contaco. Mogo is person, Kanta means inside of, and ko means to know. So that's a person inner understanding. So people who are shapeshifters know they are shapeshifters, and that you can do some training in shapeshifting, but ultimately it's you either can or you can't shapeshift. So this is really interesting to Jackson because one of the dilemmas that really put him on the path of writing this article is that he collects all of this data in 1979 from a guy called Mohammed Fofana. And Fofana talks a lot about how he's been a Yalamuffin Diginu, and he shifts into an elephant. And Jackson is like, well, why do you do it? And he says, well, he does it because he has the capacity to do it. It's like, why wouldn't I do it? He also says that because he has this capacity, it gives him a kind of an edge over other people. He has this kind of clandestine knowingness of of an ability that makes him really akin to the supernatural, right? I mean, we can say if we want to think about what does it mean the term supernatural, it's something that's outside of the elements of the natural world. And the idea that a person can transform is supernatural. It's a quite special ability. And unlike shape-shifting ideas that we might have in our culture, you might think of werewolves. Well, there's very specific rules about when werewolves can turn, right? And most of us grow up knowing that narrative. We know about werewolves. How do you get to become a werewolf? Well, you have to be infected by a werewolf, right? You have to be bitten by one. And then when do you transform? Well, not all the time, but you transform during the full moon. So even in our own culture, there is a concept of shape shifting. It is thought to give a person unique powers and abilities. And it also exists, but it exists within a set of rules. There's a set of principles that makes shape shifting possible. So this is part of the idea of animism, that within human beings there is a sacred or a spiritual or a soulful knowing of something that the person can activate now seemingly at will. This Yelema Fantingidu Tiginu. I used to be able to say this so easily. Yelema Fantiginu. Um, it's something you can turn on and off. You can decide right now that you want to shapeshift and then do it. Um, but there is an element of secrecy around it. I was very curious when I was talking to my friend Mr. Bamba, you know, like how do you do it? He's like, well, I just do it. I said, how did you learn to do it? He said, I always knew how to do it. I said, let me see you do it. And he said, oh no, this is my special thing. This is my strong thing, my special power. You can't see it. So, you know, there is an element of secrecy, and there is a kind of formality about being able to do shape shifting. Now, last week, we walked through what it means to be a person, and we said that for a lot of African societies, personhood or being a person, um, and in Malenke, when we talk about personhood, we're talking about mogoye. It's the quality of being a person. But the idea about being a person is more than just like being, like, let's say, a consumer, or to be a person is more than just being a citizen. Being a person is more than just being you. Remember, we had that image of Ubuntu, that Swahili concept of I am because you are, and it is it is through having other persons around you that you fully become a person. Personhood isn't only limited to your social relationships with the living, but personhood is also implicated in your social relationships with those who are not living, the the spirits and the souls that are in your landscape are also in communion with you in some way. The other thing to remember is that in a lot of non-Western societies, can we say most non-Western societies, mind and body are inseparable. So we spend a lot of time in our culture really influenced by this rationalist idea that comes out of the Enlightenment, that is probably most famously um, shared by the French philosopher Descartes, who has this kind of famous line where he says, I think, therefore I am, which is to say that the most important thing about a human being are your ideas, the things that you think, that the ideas that you have and the things that you think are separate somehow from your embodiment. One of the things that really challenges us as Westerners when we look at non-Western cultures is trying to imagine what it would be like to not have this mind-body separation. What if you thought about personhood and identity as something that was holistic? Animists believe that their minds and their bodies are the same thing. It's not separate. Your personhood, your mogoye, is a combination of all of the different persons that you are to all the people in your lives, and reflected in the relationships that you have with the landscape that you live in. That your daily task is to go about the world being mindful, being generous, and being in balance, being in good relationality to all the people around you. Now, typically, in a lot of non-Western societies, again, people have ideas about the way that they connect to the natural world that is also rooted in kinship. So you're a person, but you're part of a lineage, and your lineage goes back in time to what we call an apical ancestor, the first of your kind. We see this in lots of cultures around the world, that humans definitely believe that they are human, but they also sometimes have a special relationship with some element from the natural world, typically an animal. And sometimes they believe that their first ancestor developed that relationship with that animal. Or in the case of shapeshifters, sometimes your first ancestor actually was that animal. So this is where we get the idea of a totem. In anthropology, when we're talking about totems, we're talking about a kind of symbolic relationship between a lineage of people or a group of people and some element of the spirit world, frequently an animal. The word comes into our language through the work of anthropologists who worked in the Northwest coast. So Boaz and those guys. And totems there, this idea of like the totem pole, which is a physical representation of the idea of a symbolic relationship between a group of people, a lineage of people, and the animals or natural elements of the landscape. And some artist, who likely was also a shaman, has gone ahead and done that hard work of carving a physical representation of an ideological concept. So when you look at a totem pole, you're not just looking at art, you're looking at a living document, you're looking at a kinship diagram, you're looking at a notion of the world and how people who created that piece of art interacted with the concepts that created that world. What we're doing here is kind of blurry, right? And it's always blurry when you talk about faith or when you talk about ideology, because we live in the material world. We're walking around picking up our space phones and having things like staplers and pens and microphones. We have things that we interact with, and most of those things we think of as being really inert. But there are things in our environment that might actually be charged with special energies. I've got all my totems back here, my things that link me to ideologies. So I've got, all around me often. And I mean, part of it's just because I'm a cultural anthropologist and I kind of geek out on this stuff, but I've got lots of little symbols that represent ideological beliefs. And those things root me to the world that I inhabit. In the same way, the concept of shapeshifting is an avenue that's available to people, to some people of a particular lineage, who are able to claim this supernatural power and tap into those relationships with souls and spirits and powers, energies that are not necessarily present in the living world. Now, it is true that in some cultural contexts, this capacity or this power to pass between the material world into the ideological world, into the world of the souls and the spirits, is facilitated through the use of psychotropics, so or emetics, so or ethnogens. So again, this is really going to vary by the culture and who has access to that kind of power, that kind of knowledge is going to really vary by the culture and it turns out, we learned from Jackson's story, that Monsieur Fofana in 1979 gives this account of his shape shifting and talks about how the totem of the Fofana is the elephant, and so there are times when he is seized with the need to become a bush elephant. Oops, I thought I had a picture of it. Yeah. But then Michael Jackson, the New Zealand anthropologist, not the superstar, revisits Monsieur Fofana in the year 1985. And a lot has changed. There's been a lot of political turmoil. There's been a civil war. And there's also been a real interest in Sierra Leone because Sierra Leone has river diamonds. So I don't want to get too into the weeds talking about diamonds, but they're called alluvial diamonds, but they do create deposits that can be mined. So this is very different than the diamonds that are found in the southern part of Africa that are like, you have to go way, way, way deep into the earth. In parts of West Africa, there are alluvial diamonds, which is to say that they are just floating around in riverbeds. You probably know this about diamonds. It's the hardest substance on earth. It's made of carbon, and it's the last thing to erode because it's so hard. My geologists can confirm. One of the things that happens in Sierra Leone is that a lot of people set up shop doing diamond mining because it's possible to excavate a riverbed and find diamonds in it. And excavating a riverbed is a whole lot easier than trying to dig like a kimberlite mine to go way, way deep, deep down. So, there's kind of like small scale operations that are invested in diamond mining with not a whole lot of capital investment. So Muhammad clearly has gotten involved with the diamond mining, and in doing so, I bet this is surprising. If there's a field where there's a lot of money that can be made really, really quickly, it doesn't always attract the most wholesome members of the community. So one of the things that Muhammad finds as he's, in between 1979 and 1985 is that the people that he has to work with frankly suck, right? They're really mean to him, and he has a very low opinion of these people who have come to his community to facilitate this diamond mining. And so he's been cheated, he's been ripped off, he's feeling very angry. And so the person that Jackson talks about in 1985 is not the same guy. I mean, it is actually the same guy. This is this guy that he knows, but that the guy has really changed in these 6 years, in part because of all of these economic things that have happened to his community. But one of the things that happens is that this is what he says on page 67. He says, you know, in the evening, Muhammad Fofana shows up, and he was a changed man. He was taciturn, he was wary, and he was visibly older. He showed little enthusiasm for seeing me. And it's at this point that Michael Jackson says, "Hey, remember that time you told me about how you could shapeshift into an elephant?" Muhammad Fofana is like, "I never told you that." And actually, that does not surprise me because so much has happened. Fofana is not keen to share secrets, especially secrets that would make him look different. So this is what we mean about talking about faith. Um, uh, Jackson also introduces us to another term here that I just want to really quickly take a look at, and that is the term ontology. Have you heard about ontology? Do you study this in usually it turns up in philosophy? Ontology is trying to get at what is it that people truly believe? What is it that allows people to think about the world that they exist within in such a way that they are agents capable of making categories that they can use to make meaning in their world. That makes sense, right? When you were in middle school or high school, you probably had a sense of what the world looked like based on categories that you had created as a middle school student or as a high school student. Your ontological worldview, the description that you made of the world, was based on your experiences. And of course, everybody's experiences are a little bit different. But in general, you could probably say that you and the other kids that you were in high school with share some kind of ontological worldview based on the high school that you went to, or the middle school, or the elementary school for that matter. But then when you graduate and you go off to college, it's possible that your worldview changes because you come into contact with different kinds of people, different categories of people that maybe weren't in your original ontological view of the world. So ontologies can grow and they can transform. And of course, individuals don't have ontologies. I'm just using that as an example. When cultural conditions change, cultures can adapt. But that process of adaptation can frequently be very painful and also can be contentious because who gets to determine the ways that cultures change? It's usually not just like one person has said, oh, you get to decide. It's usually something that happens gradually, but it's almost always something that happens by the agreement of all the people in the culture. What Jackson is talking about that has happened here to Muhammad Fofana, and by extension, and we could argue to many, many people across the world, is that the experiences of living and interacting in a world where their own cultural beliefs are coming into contact with another set of cultural beliefs. In this case, the cultural beliefs of the diamond miners and the people who have come in from the outside to get rich have come into conflict, and it has basically forced a transformation, an ontological change in how people make meaning in their world. And the categories that they previously had are kind of falling apart. So when confronted with this recollection or this reminiscence that Jackson has, that Jackson wrote down in his notebooks, and he comes back and he says, what about this? And the guy's like, I don't know her. I don't know that. Um, that's not surprising to me because ontologically, the concept of meaning, the way that meaning has been made in Monsieur Fofana's world has been disrupted. This picture I think is funny because, the concept is ice cream. Yep. And then look at all the ways that one can categorize ice cream. And then it's also possible that there would be other ways that you can categorize ice cream if you went somewhere else and they have another way of serving or preparing ice cream. So we have a concept, but then we also have different kinds of categories of meaning that relate to that concept, and that those categories are not necessarily fixed, but have that capacity to change and transform. Like I said before, when we were talking about werewolves, there are rules for werewolves, and there are also rules for Yelema Fentiginu. One of those rules I've already mentioned, the ability to change from human to animal is inborn. It's not necessarily something that is learned. You can be trained to control it or to, make it a better transformation, but you can't, if a person can't do it, they can't do it. You either can do it or you can't do it. There's no in between. Again, it's innate to one's body. It's not something that you can learn, because if the concept is that you can learn it, you see how that's a mind body dualism? It's either innate within your body or it's not. It's not something that you can introduce. Shapeshifting can only happen while alone and observed, and that there are very serious consequences for anyone who sees the transformation, even if you see it by mistake. So there are stories about people who, unwittingly stumble upon shapeshifting secret ceremonies or secret societies, and those people don't live to tell about it. And then the other thing to note is that, this is idea that comes, I think, out of like the Marvel universe, like um, with great power comes great responsibility. Um, there are real perils, dangers associated with the ability to transform, including the idea that if you transform and then you're wounded or you're killed in animal form, you stay in animal form and no one who loves you ever knows what happened. And then, of course, you know, the idea that people are shapeshifting is threatening and can be cause for accusations of sorcery. Now, that's a really good place to shift back to Lisa Cliggett's Grains of Grass book and just wrap it up here at chapter 6. Do you remember one of the things that we find out in this book is that um, men and women have had very different experiences with poverty in Lisa Cliggett's book. And old women have a cultural feature that allows them to call on others for help. And older men don't have that. If people aren't already willing to give old men, like, let's say, respect, there's no way a man can ask for it. One of the things that we find out in this in chapter 6 is that accusations of witchcraft and sorcery are on the rise in this part of the world. Now, again, I've got another longer lecture where we're going to talk more about witchcraft and sorcery in Africa, because it's a very important topic for understanding what's going on. If you're living in a culture that doesn't necessarily separate mind body, and if you're living in a culture where your personhood is constituted by other people who live around you, then when things fall out of balance and things are not going well, like let's say a drought has been happening, as we find out was happening here, or let's say there's conflict in the area, maybe armed conflict. Sometimes it's the case that somebody needs to be held accountable. So just in the same way that in the United States, we learn principles of cause and effect, notions of cause and effect exist in other cultures too. And sometimes the cause for some kind of disruption is not something that you can observe or something that you can actually like predict. Sometimes the cause potentially is supernatural. So something supernatural has happened to create some kind of chaos that people aren't able to deal with. I've got a little video for you to watch that's about cause and effect, and I'll roll that out later this week. But one of the things that we find out is that old men typically are thought to generate sorcery, and the source the spirits, the bad spirits that Lisa Cliggett's talking about are Zyello. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but usually a sorcerer is trying to take advantage of a situation where things have already fallen out of balance. So the idea that Cliggott talks about in this chapter is that old men are not only more vulnerable because the culture doesn't allow them any kind of access to care that they would initiate, but also because they tend to be scapegoated as the people who have created the chaos. And so sometimes they are arrested or fined or even killed. So, think about this. This is very different from what we think about in our culture, where, probably most of us learned about like the Salem witchcraft trials, where it was overwhelmingly young women who were rounded up. Well, old women too. It was women who were rounded up and like branded as witches by their communities. And in some ways, we can say in hindsight, were the scapegoats for like some other set of problems that were happening. But people really do believe that witchcraft and sorcery is happening in their community. They look around and they see things are not fair, things are out of balance, things are changing very quickly. They feel threatened, they feel afraid. And when that happens, sometimes there can be like a moral panic and somebody has to be to blame. In this Gwembe Tonga community that Lisa Cliggett's talking about, the people who are held to blame are these old men who don't have much um, investment anymore because of the way that austerity and poverty has made them lose their ability to take care of themselves and their families, and they become very suspicious. So back to the Jackson article. What we learn is that there are rules, and in that story of Fofana, what we see is that this this man has had a total transformation in the way that he explains the world. In 1979, he explained the world to Michael Jackson in one way. In 1985, he has a new version. So, what do we take from this? Do we leave this article thinking, oh, people don't really believe in shapeshifters and shapeshifters don't really exist and people are just making it up? Well, I think that Jackson leaves us with a couple of thoughts that we should have about animism and about animistic beliefs like shapeshifting. One of the things that even though his narrative throws a little bit of skepticism on the idea that people are shapeshifting, he says that we always have to put into context the beliefs that people have, because shapeshifting is not only something that people believe in today, but shapeshifting is a concept that links them to a lineage or to a set of people, or we could even say their ancestors. That's like when I sat down with the gentleman that I talked to in the 80s. No, sorry, it was the 90s. Monsieur Bamba, he was telling me about shapeshifting and he was kind of smiling about it. Like, I'm not convinced that he was super serious about it. But what he was very serious about was telling me a cultural idea that he was proud of, because it was part of this way that he could explain the way that his parents and his parents' parents understood the world. And Monsieur Bamba was aware that the world is changing, at least in the part of the world that he lived, the world was changing. But he also wanted me to know that there were other ideas that had existed in that place. And he wanted me to understand what it would be like to know a drummer who was a crocodile some of the day. And this ties into number two that Jackson is saying. The shape-shifting that occurs in myths might just be symbolic, but it also signifies a kind of a comprehensive sense of identity that goes way, way back into time. the other thing that he says is like, overwhelmingly people say it's true, so it must be true, right? Like common knowledge, like everybody agrees that yeah, people can shapeshift. We know that people used to be able to shapeshift. It stands to reason that people can shapeshift now. That's not even really like disputed, like because people have this, they have the idea of shapeshifting. The idea of shapeshifting came from somewhere, so therefore shapeshifting must have at least at one time existed, which means that theoretically shapeshift could currently exist. I don't think anyone has any problems with that. In at least the people that I was talking to, they were like, yeah, we don't really believe in shapeshifting now, but shapeshifting happened. So it's, it's sort of common knowledge that shapeshifting is a potential thing that could happen. There are specific people like the Besa Tigi. Remember, I told you Tigi is someone who has a kind of a mastery. Besa means medicine. So this is a kind of training that at least theoretically some people are still receiving if they are becoming religious practitioners. And then, of course, people might know someone who claims to be a shapeshifter. Like I knew Monsieur Bamba, and Michael Jackson talks to Monsieur Fofana, and they tell you these stories about when they're shapeshifting and what happens when they shapeshift, what they do as animals, what their incentive is for doing it. And you just sort of go, okay, well, that's your experience. I think in a lot of non-Western contexts, if a person tells you something that they did and you have really no reason to believe that they're not telling you the truth, it would be very impolite to like directly challenge them and be like, bullshit, I don't believe you. That is something we do in the Western world, of course, where we want evidence. We want, show me a photos, or it didn't happen. But some things you just need to take on faith, or at least the Monday believe sometimes there are things you just need to take on faith, and that who are you to challenge the word of another adult? Now, it's also possible that people are just doing this to tell stories. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the value of their story? Why would they be telling each other stories? Why would the stories be significant? And why do people need the stories? So as we close out of this chapter, Jackson spends the last few days, the last few pages of the article looking through, kind of theory, like trying to say, well, how does theory explain the idea that someone could have a belief in shapeshifting at one point in time and then 6 years later no longer believe in shapeshifting? And he wants us to say that just because Monsieur Fofana stopped believing in shapeshifting doesn't mean that the concept of shapeshifting doesn't have some true significance for this group of people who at least formerly were animists. And this is the other thing, is that Sierra Leone is no longer really an animist nation. There's lots of Christian churches there. There's been a lot of missionary activity, and there's lots of Muslims there, and have been Muslims there since the 1400s. So, as we close out of the article that frankly suspends belief, um, keep in mind that culture is a very powerful force that can make people believe things that they can't necessarily explain to you in terms that your worldview would judge as um, credible. In other words, you've been raised in a worldview that gives you a kind of almost like a checklist for verifying the things that people tell you. And when someone has a belief, a faith, an ideology, it might not have the same checklist for credibility as yours. The other thing that we're meant to ask is the same thing that Rosalind Shaw is asking in that article that we read in the first week, is that is shapeshifting a response to a kind of deprivation of colonization? Is shapeshifting indicative of rebellion or insurgency? Another question to ask is, you know, is the person who's reporting shapeshifting experiencing an intrapsychic event where they have changed their reality or their awareness through some kind of um, psychotropic, or maybe going into a trance through drumming or through fasting? You know, there's lots of ways that we can alter our consciousness. And is that what has happened when someone reports shapeshifting? Jackson ends his article by saying, in the Western world, there are a lot of metaphors about transformation and metamorphosis. But he says that it's really interesting from his perspective. One of the things that we think about as metamorphosis is the transformation of human to machine. So that in the industrialized world, we don't really think about humans metamorphosing into animals necessarily, although that could potentially happen. But we tend to think about humans metamorphosing into cyborgs or machines. So if you think of like the Terminator, or if you think of um, some of those AI movies, um, the and Jackson says that, you know, a lot of times these collective ontological fantasies that are held by a culture can tell us a lot about the things that the culture has anxiety about. Like, what is it that the culture is fearful of? What is it that the culture believes to be its biggest threat? And so, in that way, he's arguing that that transformation to machine represents the ultimate anxiety or fear of Western culture. I'm not sure I buy that, but I mean, it's interesting to think about and to play around with. And it's definitely the kind of threshold where science fiction is a kind of fun push. I feel like I haven't done enough talking about some important African writers, but just to say that a few years ago, there was a movie that came out with the Marvel Universe called Black Panther. I'm sure you've heard of it. And Black Panther is itself part of a movement that's sometimes called Afrofuturism. And there's a number of really influential writers right now who are talking about Afrofutures and kind of bridging sci-fi and also write, you know, sort of autobiographical narratives. So I will actually go ahead and link some articles here in Blackboard for you to take a look at some of those writers if you're interested in Afrofuturism. Now, Afrofuturism isn't anthropology; it's fiction. These are novelists who are writing a view of the world. But what if the futuristic views of the world are more like Wakanda, like the Black Panther universe, than they are like, I don't know, whatever kind of like Walking Dead, or these kind of like Western notions of the future tend to be very dystopic and apocalyptic. But African versions of the future tend to be much more hopeful and organic. So I'll link some articles there for you. So I hope you enjoyed the article, and I will see you again here with more articles that we will talk through. Bye.